Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Japan Club Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, Yuki.
I'm Gerry.
Bryce.
Yes, familiar faces all around. Today's subject we are going to be talking about, if you've been following along with our little progression here, you would know that every third episode is going to be the history segment, which means that if you haven't already picked up on some of what we've been talking about, I suggest you look back on some of our posting history and see if you can sort of catch up on all the history, because otherwise this section might not make a whole lot of sense. But today we're going to be talking about the post Sengoku era period, the period immediately following, which you can call either the Edo period, if you would like, or you can call it the Tokugawa Shogunate. Either way, it's kind of the same general period of time. There's some places where one doesn't apply and the other does, but we'll get into those details kind of right into it. Just to lay down some brief sort of groundwork, basically just a review of the end of the Sengoku era. Uh, Oda Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi did a lot of work to unify Japan successfully. After Nobunaga's death at the betrayal of his general, Hideyoshi took over as the sort of head honcho. And while he did have a son, the son was too young to rule. And so he would go on to have a rather disastrous attempt to invade Korea, which is a whole separate discussion that, unless there's interest, we probably won't go too much into. But the Korean War was a disaster. Japan lost a huge chunk of its military, but the only one that didn't was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who managed to get out of it as part of the deal he made with Hideyoshi, where he essentially said, "I will not challenge your authority as shogun if you just don't make me do stuff." And so after Hideyoshi died, there was a huge power vacuum that Tokugawa, who was the biggest player, had the biggest number of soldiers and stuff. He was the richest, so he took over as the shogun, as a regent. But let's be honest, there was never any possibility that he was going to be anything but the only shogun and his line. And that's the beginning, really, of the Edo period. Is kind of it's marked really by the Battle of Sekigahara, which is kind of the point at which sort of the shogunate was really kind of cemented as the central power in all of Japan. And so that's really where we can where we can kind of jump right into the chronology. So we have our resident experts here to talk about that. So
Oh God. So the Battle of Sekigahara was really the battle that established Tokugawa supremacy. I think that was the victory over that was the Toyotomi forces, right? And the remnants were wiped out basically in 1615 with the siege of Osaka. But in between that, there's some important points. Like in 1603, that's when the shogunate was established in Edo, but the capital still remained in Kyoto, and that's where the emperor still lived, and that's where the imperial power still technically resided. But the central focus became in Edo. In 1605, Ieyasu technically retired as shogun and was succeeded by his son Hidetada.
This is actually,
but I think.
Oh, sorry, just as a brief aside, it's critically important that he did step aside instead of actually dying, because that essentially created the line of succession, which the previous two heads of Japan never could establish. So the fact that he retired is huge, just as an FYI. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I think the line lasts to about, I think it's 15 shoguns, which is pretty nice.
Long line. Very successful, you could say.
So that basically freed Ieyasu up to do, a lot of the work before. I didn't put when he died, but here I have this big section on the governmental structure he created. If you want me to explain that.
Yeah, let's go right into that.
So he put a lot of measures in to basically make sure that the Tokugawa doesn't lose supremacy, doesn't lose power, and a power struggle doesn't happen that occurred, in the Sengoku era. So first off, he established what's called the Buke Shohato, or laws for military houses, and they're basically super strict standards for all the other daimyo that they had to follow, and it regulated a lot of aspects of their lives. It involved I put private life, marriage, the way they dress, the way they conduct themselves. They have to visit Edo every other year, I think, and they have to leave their family behind, which is this sort of hostage situation. So basically, the daimyo have to support, absolute loyalty basically to the shogun. And there's this hierarchy of levels of daimyo. I think there's like 3 levels based on how much the shogun trusts them, and then that determines, what sort of domain they control. And I'll go over on what the domains are, but that's
artifact domain.
Yeah, basically there's like really absolute hierarchy.
Hmm.
And then second, he establishes the kokudaka system, which is pretty interesting. It's basically a new national taxation system. The value of the domains are determined by their rice output, basically. And one koku
This comes into play a lot later. This comes
Yeah.
into play a lot later. Just pointing that out for people.
Yeah. One koku is basically the amount of rice that can feed a person per year. I didn't put down how many bushels that is, but that's pretty much a lot of rice. So, and that leads to what's called the Bakuhan Taisei, or basically a combination of Bakufu and Han, which is the domains I was talking about. So basically the Han is I kind of relate it to what are like congressional districts. They're basically not related to the provinces that already existed or the territories, but they're basically areas of agricultural output. And the largest was the Kaga Han, or the Kaga domain, which is where the Tokugawa shogunate was centered. I think it's like around Edo. And it basically had around 1 million koku at one point. So that decided taxation purposes. It was started by Toyotomi, but he carried it forward and developed it into this. And so it created this level of, I kind of liken it to federalism, but it's not federalism yet. It's still technically feudalism. The shogun has national jurisdiction, and the daimyo are in charge of these Han, basically. So, and then the last point I have is Neo-Confucianism is carried on from China. It's technically established as the official religion, but it's more like the official philosophy of the state. And he meant it more to be followed by the officials and the administration. He didn't mean for the peasants and the lower classes to actually follow this. But they were sure against some other religions, as we might talk about.
That'll come up later, bro.
Yeah.
We're getting there. Couple years in.
But yeah, so basically Ieyasu established this sort of, rigid structure that established basically 250 years of pretty stable rule.
Yeah, it's curious actually how little of the structure actually changed. Like he implemented a lot of like these sort of less visible rules, like the daimyo control thing. But in general, he kept like the structure of the feudal Japan, with the emperor being what he was, the shogun, and then all the daimyo.
Exactly, yeah.
And that really goes to show like just how in many ways the Tokugawa shogunate was kind of a big deal because it unified Japan, but in other ways it didn't change too much about sort of the base like understanding. Like if you were just an average Japanese citizen, to be fair, you always had a daimyo and you always had an emperor and stuff like that, right? So from their perspective, like they might not see a lot of these changes, even as they're all of a sudden now being taxed by people in different sets of armor.
Yeah, I was gonna go into it later, but Toyotomi was like famous for the sword hunts he conducted, confiscating everyone's swords and trying to control the weapons. But I don't think the Tokugawa actually did that sort of thing to that extent. He really was just pretty chill and said, yeah, you can carry your weapons, just don't go crazy. And it basically worked out.
Yeah.
They did control arms within the area of Edo, I think, through like checkpoints and in order to like make sure not like a controlled rebellion doesn't really occur. But there wasn't any crazy sword ban or anything. And
that also comes later.
Yeah, later, but but yeah, so
yeah, no, like as you like just as a common theme, you'll see like taxation. They're the right to tax the entire population. That having that as solidifying that was kind of like a massive deal, because I mean, if you control the food, you control basically everything in this particular instance, because like back in this is like just basic anthropology, but like back in like the old days, the only reason like money was ever invented was so that you could track food. And so while taxation mostly happens in terms of rice, like it's still kind of, even in these complex governmental structures and all that, at the very end of the day, like the biggest army controls the most food, and therefore you control the entire country. And that's really something that the Sengoku era was entirely centered around. And also, it's
Yeah.
funny to know. I did know this last time, but it's funny because like literally like maybe less than 5 years after Tokugawa just annihilates his opposition and just becomes the shogun leader of Japan, he just retires like less than a handful of years after he does it. Because he was that confident that his line would continue because he'd been teaching his son. I mentioned this last week as well, but yeah, like, you know, all that for just a couple of years of shogun, and then he just goes and retires and I don't know, writes poetry or whatever it is retired warlords do in their spare time.
Rule from the shadows.
So yeah,
All right.
and then the next part I believe you have here is, you know, all the more questionable things that the shogunate did.
The more questionable things.
Yeah. So from a period about 1612 to 1629, that's when we see some measures and actions take. I didn't write them all down, the specifics, but actions taken against Christianity and basically suppressing Christians. We could talk about, you know, silence and like all the like missionary work, but
Tremble upon the image.
that basically culminates in 1638 with the Shimabara rebellion. And that's also the turning point to Sakoku, or the period of closed country, basically. I don't know if we wanted to elaborate on the rebellion. I think basically, you know, Christian pushback against Tokugawa shogunate, that doesn't really go well. It's basically a massacre.
Like essentially,
to put it lightly.
Yeah. I never saw Silence, so I don't actually have the context for that. But
we read it.
We read it.
This is how little I know about it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there was a movie made. Yeah.
Never read it. I
heard the movie was okay, actually.
Yeah. I still have to watch that.
And so, yeah, like the gist of the long and the short of it is basically like there were increasing number of restrictions, and like basically there were some daimyo, of course, that were also Christian and such, and like the Tokugawa. Essentially, it was just a matter of like whether or not it was Christianity at the time threatened to cause a disequilibrium in this system of sort of control that the daimyo, that the shogun had established over the regional warlords and over the population. Because it was basically like they saw it as these Western powers coming in and kind of influencing the population, and that was like it was almost like a sort of form of intellectual warfare to them. You know, like the more people they convert to Christianity, the less influence the shogun has, and the less influence that they have as like their divine right to rule Japan and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So because of that, you know, Shimabara rebellion was just kind of the sort of bursting of all these grievances the Christians had, of all these restrictions that are being placed on them.
Yeah, I also found out that a secondary goal of Sakoku was basically this point I have here. Basically, the daimyo themselves were still, you know, trading with foreign countries, and the Tokugawa wanted to make sure that there wouldn't become this they wouldn't become any more powerful through like trade with other countries, and basically cut off the daimyo from surpassing the like Tokugawa itself. So that, along with making sure that there's no influence from basically Spain and Portugal. I think England and the Dutch tried to say, hey, we're not really intruding on your country, so let us trade. And they're basically like saying, okay, the Dutch are pretty okay, so we'll let you trade at, you know, Dejima.
They also wanted guns.
That too.
They really liked the guns.
Yeah. And like it's one of those things where you can actually feel the effects of this, you know, this era of persecution to this day, because like obviously if this wasn't apparent, there's not a large Christian population in Japan. And like it didn't used to be that way, because for a time the missionaries were pretty successful in terms of, you know, converting people to Christianity, and like it was actually spreading to an extent. But then like after the shogunate realized that it was getting pretty popular, they kind of put a stop to it, and it just never got a foothold ever since. So, you know, the population, it's not that there is an inherent incompatibility between Japanese people and Christianity so much as it was that there was a time when the ball was rolling and then it just got stopped, and there hasn't been any concerted effort to re-Christianize, I suppose, because in this particular day and age, mass missionary work in developed countries is not as common. Countries aren't making concerted efforts to convert other countries to their religion.
Yeah.
The way that Silence puts it, and I think it's actually really accurate for how it happened over the course of this period, is that it's not necessarily that Christianity doesn't make sense in a Japanese context. It kind of does struggle because of it being a monotheistic religion and Japan having a history of not having issues, multiple gods being a thing.
Yeah.
But the way Silence puts it is, it's like trying to plant a tree in infertile soil. It's not going to work because it's just not being, it's not good soil for it. The environment is not sufficient for Christianity to flourish because of the timing. And after that, it led to Sakkoku, and Sakkoku kind of just screwed everything for it.
Yeah, that's very true. Poor. I mean, poor timing is one way to put it. Another way to put it is that they created the poor timing, because if Christianity wasn't popular, then Sakkoku might not have happened. I mean, probably still would have, but like it might not have happened.
Like, basically, if it had not been like a targetable cause of Sakkoku, I don't think it would have been as actively persecuted.
Yeah,
like it still would have struggled a bit, I think, but I don't think it would have been nearly as painful for the missionaries as it ended up being, had that not been the case.
And this is one of those trends in history that you're going to see a lot of the time. Like, it's very popular with like Silk Road stuff, where ideas travel along these trade routes, and that's how religion spread. That's how sort of technology also spreads. And what Japan kind of wanted was, they wanted the material benefits of trading without the intellectual baggage that came with it. And to that extent, they figured the best solution was to just have trade limited to these ports, where they could heavily regulate what gets spread in terms of, ideas and materials. And, you could make the argument that it kind of worked, in the sense that there isn't much Christianity in Japan. You could also make the argument that Japan kind of did nothing for 200 years on an international scale.
Yeah.
You could argue that it did work because it kind of stifled their technological development.
Yeah. So,
they fixed that though. They fixed that though.
There's a big wake up call.
Yeah, that happens way later.
Well, I mean,
so yes, that, and then as Gerry said, it's isolated to kind of 4 specific locations that essentially they could trade with, like China. The Dutch are cool. In general, the Dutch tend to be cool. Well, the Dutch are pretty cool. I mean, they're not usually the first you point to when you talk about the evils of imperialism. So
usually.
Yeah,
it goes
the Netherlands gave the important part is Netherlands gave Western textbooks that the Japanese studied, and this became known as Rangaku, or Dutch studies, and where they learned about stuff like anatomy and possibly electricity.
I definitely thought you were going to say they gave them tech support.
Tech support.
You're not wrong.
Yo, I got a light bulb that I need to fix, bro. 1630. But yeah, it became a sort of source for Western learning and learning from other countries, but it was still a bit stifled. It didn't flourish and develop as if like Sakkoku didn't exist. So.
Yeah. All right. What is this? What is this Meriki fire that you have listed?
Yeah, I was trying to find events in between. Basically, it was this large fire that happened in Edo. That basically, herder. There's a bunch of wooden houses in the district. There's a fire that starts that no one really knows how it started, and basically, a lot of people died. This caused some sort of restructuring of both the firefighting capabilities and the building code to some extent, so that these sort of fires don't happen. But this was a large ass fire. I don't know how it compares to the London fire, but this was so great that they changed, because they still have era names. It's a different system than what happens during the Meiji Restoration. But it was so bad that they had to change the era name, like after this, from Meireki to Manji, I think. So Uh,
Did you happen to know if that's because the emperor died in the fire, or because they switched? Like, because usually era names are based on the emperor.
it's
or
it's
the
either one. Either the emperor dies or something bad happens. That's what there's this one.
Okay, I guess it just
Yeah.
hasn't happened in a while. So,
Yeah.
because like all
I'm
I
trying
know
to
is we
keep it
change
that way.
Yeah.
all I know is we change when the emperor changes. There hasn't been an event so bad that we've had to change it. You know.
Yeah, it's a let's retire the name Katrina, moment. So
Gotcha. So like based on a timeline that we've constructed, this is like a what 200 year stretch of period where we just don't have a lot that we can really talk about. Is that right, Gerry?
yeah, not a lot to talk about, but we can go to the
Yeah,
aside. The other topics notes has
I was gonna
stuff about
suggest
like,
that. Yeah, I was gonna suggest
yeah,
that
like,
we do that.
so obviously during this period there's like a lot of art development. I put down like they have the development of ukiyo-e, which is the genre of folklore art basically in Japan, and under that is like stuff like woodblock prints. And I forgot, I don't know when it was made, but like stuff like Hokusai made, the wave off Kanagawa, that type of thing.
Yeah, the great way.
Um,
Oh yeah.
There's like kabuki theater. I think some people are pretty familiar with that. Do you have any other suggestions? I mean,
We can just kind of talk about these sort of in from like topic to topic. For instance, there are some things that I could say about ukiyo-e in terms of like its influence.
yeah.
Because yeah, like I'm an art major, and so one of the things that you learn about in our history is kind of this period of time, sort of in Europe and in the U.S. Well, actually, no, this is like it doesn't really this like ukiyo-e technically begins in like the 1600s, right? But really, what happens is that because of a combination of reasons, not the first of which being that Japan didn't really have a lot of international influence at this time. One of the things that makes ukiyo-e huge is what happens kind of later on, when not only is kind of the U.S. already a thing, because this is kind of after the U.S. is formed. I think this be like, correct me if I'm wrong, but around the time of like early Meiji Restoration, sort of like that period of Japan kind of really coming into its own, ukiyo-e is still around, and it kind of spreads to these Western countries. And there's almost a reversal of culture where all these European and American artists all of a sudden just see these wooden blocks of these wood block prints of like all this Japanese art, and they end up just being really, really influenced by it. And so like it's a huge, like Japanese woodcuts are actually a huge thing that influence many famous artists that you might recognize. Like for instance, Vincent van Gogh was actually very inspired by Japanese woodblock prints, and it just goes to show just how how much of a big deal it was. And this wasn't something that like this was something that was mostly isolated to Japan while it was isolated, obviously, but like this period of time was one where like it was a cultivation of culture, kind of like the Heian in some ways, where sort of the techniques and the technology kind of stayed relatively stable, but it was just allowed to be refined. And so when the major restoration era came about and Japan was kind of spreading its ideas out, ukiyo-e hadn't really changed all that much since it was first kind of conceptualized in sort of the 1600s. But then yeah, it's huge influence that kind of you can feel in a lot of Western art as well. And so that's just something that I just wanted to point out, is how influential ukiyo-e can be internationally as well. It's not just a Japan thing.
Yeah, I think I read some speculation that Starry Night was inspired by the wave off Kanagawa that I was talking about. That sort of style with the, I'm not an art major, but I could kind of see the similarities. But
yeah, it's got a lot of there's definitely a lot of crossover, because one of the things that sort of the Japanese style did was it really kind of made it made use in many ways of sort of simplicity of color and sort of like color and having like these hard edges to have transitions between like say an outline and the coloration or something, whereas a lot of things like impressionist art tends to be very much kind of this blurry in a way kind of sensation, like it's very much focused on the visual sensation of certain scenes rather than how sort of outlined, I guess you could say. And there's plenty of influence of that in a lot of the art that was influenced by sort of ukiyo-e and other Japanese art forms. I mean, you can kind of see the similarities actually in how like ukiyo-e influences like modern manga art to this day, right? Like sort of the emphasis on like, having insisting that like a lot of this stuff has like strong outlines for the characters and stuff like that, and like the kind of relatively simplistic form of like manga and stuff that has its roots in some of the sort of techniques that these early woodblock prints kind of utilized.
Yeah, like the use of I think the effects in manga as like sort of the screen printing procedure kind of is reminiscent of ukiyo-e, where they have these wood blocks with like paint, like they press it on, and I see the sort of roots of manga in that.
And so yeah, it's just the more you know. I mean, yeah, I know less about kabuki theater. I'm going to be honest. Like, it's one of those aspects of Japanese culture that I've just never been able to really interact with. Like, my parents are never going to like tap me on the shoulder and be like, "Hey, you want to go see a kabuki show?" I mean, those things. I mean, I imagine that only like people of culture are those that would go there, and so they're probably. It's not one of those mass concert performances like you'll see in Tokyo all the time. So it might be harder to get tickets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I miss it. People of culture.
Yeah. That being said, the one thing we can talk about for kabuki theater is kind of just how the aesthetic of it really sort of like became ingrained in Japanese culture.
Yeah.
Because like if you look at these woodblock prints in art, you'll see that a lot of them are dressed and look in ways that people in kabuki theater would dress, with like the white makeup and like the red lips and all that stuff, right? Like the sort of like red, sort of like if you've seen an episode of Naruto, you'll know kind of what I'm talking about. That particular show is influenced quite a bit by the kabuki aesthetic in a way, especially with Jiraiya, the character.
Yeah.
Because like for instance, it's a lot of overlap. Like ukiyo-e likes to depict kabuki individuals, like things like Enka is typically very popular as kind of a background soundtrack to a lot of kabuki performances and all that stuff. So all of these art forms kind of overlap and cross over.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like things that you might associate with kind of the very Japanese aesthetic, like the sort of red eyeliner directly underneath the eyes, the long white hair, or the black hair that kind of looks like the Fire Nation from Avatar, except it's that stuff is very much been solidified in kabuki theater, and so it was kind of like a sort of microcosm of Japanese culture at the time. It is a very good way to describe it, I guess.
Yeah.
So all I'm hearing is omoshiroi. Or Octo's literally just
Octo is just a kabuki
like
theater.
All right.
You'll see it in a lot of Japanese media. There's like
There was that one character who
there's always that one character who just looks like he's straight out of a kabuki play or something. Like it's a very common aesthetic, I would say.
Another thing that's really fun that you'll often recognize in the kabuki theater is like one of the ways that they like to punctuate certain things. They have like a wooden block that they slam onto the ground. It creates this like clack clack sound like that. That's huge. That's like I'm not sure. There's definitely a formal name for it. I just don't know it. But that is like that's like kind of the calling sign of kabuki theater is that like they'll wear those those wooden sandals. That's a great way to make the sound as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in kabuki theater. There's a lot of hard punctuation of with sound and visual impact.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kabuki theater in a nutshell. Like a real expert might be able to talk about it a bit more, but that's all we could probably tell you about.
All right.
So yeah, what's next on here?
Other things I jotted down was like obviously the growth of cities was pretty significant during the Edo period. Of course, agriculture was important, so agriculture growth also improved as the population grew to an extent. We'll go over that later. But basically, this became the time in which Japan sort of began to modernize gradually to the state of like a country. They got their shit together after they were unified. So
yeah, it was
like
definitely steady. I would say
like,
it's definitely steady improvement.
Yeah,
but
it's almost like not having centuries of constant warfare will do good things for urbanization and increases in population.
Yeah.
Yeah, bro. People started living long enough to get things done. That's crazy.
Yeah, right. If you got angry, you don't just murder your neighbor because you have a sword in your.
They definitely still did that for at least 100 years.
Yeah, but it got less common. But yeah, no, like it's important to realize that like urbanization wasn't just something that happened exclusively during the Meiji era. Like people were, trying to increase the general civilization level of the nation over time, slowly, but surely. People are able
Yeah.
to gather in larger groups, coordinate more, because now you no longer were stuck to one village because the warlord in that particular region will execute you if you cross into their territory or anything, right? So
Yeah, I think they made a pretty big system of roads. Like at least the effort to make a consolidated road system. So I think travel was probably much easier, much safer, quotation mark. It was easier to go from place to place after this time.
mhm.
And not be as worried for your life.
Yeah.
Look, it's a boar.
So we yeah. Anything to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's important to realize just how little of Japan's land is actually arable. Like the US could have somewhere between like 30 and 40% of its land being arable. I don't know about that number, but it's definitely like high, like relatively speaking. But like Japan's percentage of arable land is about 11%. And so like any increases in the ability to farm the land, whether that's because you're no longer going to be attacked by roving gangs of samurai or because you just have, more people to help you, that's huge for population growth and population, control, that kind of thing. So food in Japan is a huge concern because it's a tiny archipelago with mostly mountains and active volcanoes.
To put this in perspective, 70% of Japan is mountain. 70%.
I'll be honest, I don't know how we survived.
I don't think they do either. They kind of just got away with it. Yeah, there's a reason fruits are expensive in Japan.
Yeah, but Fuji apples are good though.
Yeah, but it's expensive.
Yeah, they are expensive.
You go to a konbini and you can get like some seafood for like $2-3, and the fruit and the milk and anything that has to do with like having land is like 10 to 20.
Yeah. We often talk about how modernization, like the first world countries are very dependent on international trade, like more so than probably a lot of other countries. Japan, if international trade stopped, Japan would just be screwed.
Yeah.
Most of the population would starve within like half a year, I would say, because the amount of population in Japan relative to the amount of food that is produced locally is just, it's a huge deficit. And a lot of what Japan is able to do is through imports. So
Yeah, the exports are how they pay for it, obviously, but that food, they ain't got that. They just ain't got that.
Now that'll become something of an issue going forward, is the constant question of whether or not Japan has enough food is huge for right up until the end of World War II, arguably.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to keep in mind, is they're working on it, but there is a ceiling at which point they just can't produce the food that they need. So yeah.
Yep.
So we could talk about sword hunts now.
I mean, I think we kind of touched on it.
A little bit. Are there any details that we didn't really cover with sword hunts that we could? So yeah, one of the funny stories that we could talk about is how like once the I believe it was Hideyoshi, once he got all the swords that he wanted, he just had them all melted down and turned into statues of the Buddha.
Yeah.
Because
kind of metal, no pun intended.
Yeah.
Make love, not war. Just peace and all that. So that was an interesting story. Like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I guess one interesting comparison you could make that might be worth talking about is the idea of like comparing it to like gun control in the United States, because for essentially, to translate it into terms that might be more relevant, essentially Japan had de facto open carry laws when it came to katanas and all these other swords. If you were, if you had one, otherwise just carried around like knives or whatever it is, because there were bandits everywhere and you needed to defend yourself and your family. But what happened was that they essentially just said to the population, if you're of such and such rank, you are no longer allowed to carry a sword around. And then, obviously, because what they were afraid of were peasant uprisings and all that stuff from the taxation and from the military control and all that. And so, yeah, just swords were kind of taken from mostly peasants, really. And the reason why they didn't resist was because the alternative was to essentially pick fights with highly trained soldiers in like way better armor than you. So it'd be as if the U.S. attempted to confiscate guns from people by literally having the army take them from people.
There are some people afraid of that. We got to talk about all that, but there are some people afraid of that.
So yeah,
Conspiracy.
It's pretty terrifying if you're just some peasant and all of a sudden some guys beat on your door like, hey, give us your swords. You're not allowed to have them anymore.
That's
Right?
illegal. We know you have them.
Not all sunshine and rainbows in the land of the rising sun. So
So okay.
Yeah. And then we can talk about samurai and how they.
Yeah, we can touch a little bit on, following from our podcast on samurai and ninja.
Yes.
So yeah, the samurai class as itself began to decline during this period. Basically, a period of peace means they don't have any military function, so they're just sitting around protecting what. The samurai began to basically take on other interests. I put down scholarly work. Some became bureaucrats who worked under the new daimyo system. Some became entrepreneurs, basically. This also caused a sort of transition with swordsmiths as well. They're manufacturing swords, but now they sort of transition to making like kitchen cutlery. Just rebrand that business. Your wife can use this.
Yeah, there's a reason Japanese knives are kind of crazy.
Yeah,
they got really good at making cutlery. Lots of practice.
It's like, sword, we can't make swords anymore. It's like, I have an idea.
What if we just made a shorter sword?
What if we just made a shorter sword?
That's basically, yeah.
What happens?
The samurai themselves, the weapons, is sort of, instead of weapons, they became symbols of authority. So in certain ceremonies, you still see them carry the daisho, or like, the katana and the wakizashi. But they weren't used, basically. There was a sort of spotty information where, there's some like situations in which you could draw on a commoner, but I doubt to see that would happen that often. But yeah, the samurai were still technically around though. They weren't formally abolished until the series of measures and edicts that were taken during the Meiji period. But they were basically, not there.
Yeah, because if say you're the shogun and you have this like really large and trained group of soldiers all armed to the teeth just sitting around with nothing to do, the thing that you're afraid of are two possibilities: one, a military coup, and two, banditry. Right? Like, and to be fair, that happened quite often in periods where like you never, essentially as a ruler, you never just want to have your army sitting around doing nothing. And if you have two choices: either send them off to fight something or disarm them. Those are kind of your only two options. And so the shogun in this particular instance, because things were relatively under control, just said, all right, as a samurai class, you guys are kind of less important now than you used to be back when we were all in civil war.
Yeah.
So that was definitely something that happened. That was of significance, is like this: the samurai as a class was kind of began to fall out of relevance. They weren't irrelevant yet, but they were getting there slowly.
I wouldn't even say slowly.
Well, yeah, it happened all at once near the end, but you know. So
yeah, there's a lot of discontent with the samurai class that stewed over the years and kind of manifested itself right around right around that time.
Like we'll get to that.
Like it's not only like, logistically speaking, it's not only a money sink because you're paying for their upkeep and all that stuff and their equipment and whatever. It's also like, if they're not actively helping you maintain power, like obviously you want to hold a garrison so that you can enforce order and stuff, but they're just kind of, it's a waste of resources to keep them upkept if you're not planning to use them. And so it's more in the interests of the shogun and the leadership to just kind of say, all right, well, we're just going to cut your funding and give us back your swords or whatever. Because, I mean,
Yeah.
if
Y'all
they
are
turn into ninjas,
educated. You got that. Get a job.
Yeah, their literacy was a pretty important part to them, like going into scholarly work and the education basically sector.
Yeah.
Because like samurai were one of the few individuals who actually were literate and trained, these sort of things. So
yeah, they weren't like left high and dry. Most of the samurai were extremely wealthy individuals, so they just moved on to bigger and better things, essentially.
yeah.
But they missed their honor.
Yeah, their right to
Honors
murder
died
people.
at the beaches of Komura. Anyway.
They lost their divine right to kill peasants.
The divine right to kill peasants.
So anyway,
All right.
period of isolation has been closed until some individuals arrived with huge boats.
So,
Gunboats.
so yeah, we can back to history. In 1853. Basically, yeah. So Commodore Matthew Perry was tasked by President Millard Fillmore. I think that's it. To basically,
yeah, I think so.
yeah, to basically, one, do that manifest destiny thing we were talking about, and two, we need some resources. So basically, Japan was one of the targets of we need to start trading some stuff. And so Matthew Perry shows up with,
by the way, it was Fillmore.
he shows up with 4 warships at Uraga in near Kanagawa, which is where this whole situation revolves around. And basically, the Japanese sight these ships and they're like, huh, these ships are they on fire? There's some black smoke rising from these ships, and basically, yeah, there's steamships with huge guns.
And my man goes, knock, knock, open up. And they're kind of like, oh, those are guns. Oh, you got guns. All right.
Yeah, they initially refuse him entry. And then Perry's like, nah, I ain't moving. And it's basically gunboat diplomacy. He basically threatens to I'm about to burn Edo if you don't let me in. And they're like, oh, okay. You can go onto these beaches. They go into the beaches and they're met with these officers with only swords. And they're like, oh, okay. So yeah, Perry forces himself in. And he delivers Fillmore's letter, basically requesting to establish trade relations. And he says, I'll come back for an answer.
Requesting.
Yeah, requesting. So they will return in about, I think, either it's a few months or up to a year, basically. And then this is what's left, basically. So the shogun leadership, I think I read, the shogun basically dies a few days after the Perry leaves to return for an answer. And he's succeeded by a shogun who's particularly weak. I think he might be described as sickly. And so this leaves the leadership pretty, weak and given off to the Council of Elders led by Abe Masahiro. And this is for the first time it's left to this Council of Elders to basically debate among themselves of what the hell they do, how would they decide, and without the leadership of the shogun. And so in 1854, they decide about it for a few months, debate about it, and they take a poll. I think that was pretty inconclusive. Perry returns with 8 warships instead of 4. And he's like, all right, what's your answer? And it's at this time in which they had the famous show of technology. So basically, Perry came in with a miniature steam train or something like that. It's like, whoa. And the Japanese showed off sumo wrestling. And typical Perry wrote in his notes, I don't like it. It's the work of savages. What the hell is sumo wrestling like? He looked down upon what the Japanese showed off. Typical Western attitude. But basically the elders agreed, yeah, we can't refuse, basically.
Yeah.
So we'll agree to your terms. And this was the Kanagawa Joyaku, or the Kanagawa Treaty. It basically opened up Shimura and Hakodate, the 2 ports, to American trade, established an American consulate in Japan. And there's 6 other terms that basically, said the Americans can come in at any time. And this was effectively the end of the Sakoku period.
Yep.
And
definitely stop having it be closed with that.
Yeah, yeah. And so it established American terms. There was there was a huge faction that became not happy with this Western intrusion. But the shogunate couldn't refuse. And so this led to, we got to start modernizing, the Navy, the Army, our technological capabilities afterwards. But this became, the sort of tipping point of, we'll talk about the decline of the Tokugawa shogunate. So
Yeah. And it's important to realize at this time, like, I mean, just for some historical context, to give you an idea of just Japan kind of already was very wary of the West because China was just across the sea. And of course, I'm sure that those of you that are interested in history know stuff about like the Opium War that occurred between China and Great Britain and all that stuff, and just how their biggest foe for like hundreds of years just got utterly humiliated by these Western powers. And so the shogunate at the time, like they projected this aura of authority and strength. Because obviously they're the shogunate, they're the ones in charge. But at the same time, the fact that when Matthew Perry arrived and just made these demands that were immediately kind of followed through, it just went to show how weak the shogunate had become and how backwards Japan was as a country. And so that really was the wake up call that Japan really needed to kick itself back into high gear.
Yeah, yeah, they kicked it into high gear. They Meiji kind of crazy. But yeah, like Yuki is saying, the biggest thing that this showed was that there were a lot of benefits to closing the country, but the ramifications were far beyond anything that Japan could have imagined, because 200 years ago, I don't think people were imagining guns on boats. So that kind of that right when that happened, they were like, yeah, we got to catch up. Some people were heavily against it, though, as is often the case when there's a lot of change. And this kind of led to not a power vacuum right away, but it led, as we're saying, the decline of the Bakufu and a lot of debate over what Japan should be looking like in the wake of Western countries being so different and powerful now.
Yep.
So so we call this period of the decline the Bakumatsu, which is the end of the Bakufu.
Yeah.
And it's the end of the Bakufu as a thing, because this was the last shogunate.
Yeah.
And it's not any one thing we can pin as the exact cause. It's a number of things that sort of led to this decline of the shogunate. I enumerated a couple here. So basically, the Tokugawa set up this system with the Kokudaka, basically an agrarian system, but that would face some pressure with the urban development, the commercialism, and the rise of the merchant class. Basically, would be at odds against this sort of oh, we only value rice system. There was some weird, I looked into it, it's like a real rabbit hole, some economic reforms that sought to increase taxes, increase revenue for the government, that were understandably unpopular.
Understandably.
No one likes taxes.
There was
they really like their taxes.
As we said, the agriculture output did increase during this time, but so did the population, and there were times at which they couldn't meet those demands. And so there were periods of famine, there were periods of peasant unrest, I think a few rebellions that of course quelled. There were a couple of natural disasters, mostly earthquakes, that shook the foundations of the shogunate. We're talking about the Western intrusion that began to increase from before and after the Sakoku. That became a concern, and eventually would be a thing. And the waning strength of the Tokugawa leadership. So with each successive Tokugawa shogun, they didn't have the pompous authority that Ieyasu left behind. So as that began to the fact that there's a lineage is pretty important, but as it sort of declined and as the leaders began to weaken in strength and authority, it was only a matter of time.
Yeah, that all of these are problems that are inherent in really any civilization that's looking to kind of increase its power and influence or catch up in this particular instance. Like, for instance, Great Britain has had that problem of kings just kind of falling into irrelevancy and weakness as the generations go by, especially in periods of peace. The US has plenty of problems in its early development between agrarianism and sort of urbanization, between the conflicts with Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans and the Federalists and all that stuff. There's a huge questions that are constantly at play in any civilization, and Japan is no different in that particular aspect. Well, like Gerry said, one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is the idea of like these factions of either let's join the Westerners and become powerful, and screw the Westerners, let's make Japan great again. And the Tokugawa shogun was kind of caught in the middle with like a giant shrug emoji, where they just kind of did whatever the gunboats told them to do. They were that weak.
Whatever the gunboats tell them.
So like there was a real lack of strong decision making in leadership, and that created as Bryce said earlier, like a power vacuum in a way, because the Tokugawa shogun was being completely ineffective. And so these rival factions get kind of a mass influence over time and say, you know what, if Tokugawa shogun can't run things, we should run things. And that's something that you'll see, very, very, very soon.
Yeah, so down here I have at this time from about 1850 to 1860 was the rise of this Sono Joi movement, which is like a political movement basically. It's taken from Neo-Confucianism. It was originally a Chinese phrase, and I put down it's a Yoji Jukugo. As we mentioned before in our language episode, it's a sequence of 4 kanji. That's basically singular idea, but it basically means revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. And I don't think we need to explain much on what that means, but
Pretty self-explanatory.
it was basically a huge movement of anti-Western sentiment and pushback against the increasing intrusion, starting with Perry, of them meddling in like Japanese affairs. This was supported by mostly the imperial court and the 2 domains Satsuma and Choshu, which would be really important later on.
Just as an FYI, those 2 were some of the most powerful regions currently in all of Japan. Like they were hugely influential, and so the fact that they were doing things was very significant. They weren't some tiny backwater district.
Yeah. And so after that, it's basically a sequence of events of leading to the Meiji, basically. So in 1863, it was the Emperor Komei, the current emperor. He's also the dad of Emperor Meiji. He sent out the order to expel the barbarians. It was basically a formal announcement. It wasn't any like declaration of war or anything, but he's like, yeah, we're gonna start persecuting foreigners. That's a good idea.
For some reason.
It gets bloody. So there's like cases of diplomats, Western diplomats, like on the street or like that just get attacked by samurai. Like not samurai this time, but like they get cut down. It gets real messy. And so an example is I have later in that year, 1863, was the Anglo-Satsuma War, or it's called the bombardment of Kagoshima.
Which is my hometown, by the way.
Yikes!
So, yeah, basically you got British ships just like chilling, and they face a battery from the coast from like the Japanese basically, and they're like, whoa, what's going on?
Whoa! He can do all that.
The ultimate result is yes, the British are forced to retreat. They're just like, okay, they really don't like us. We'll just like back off for now. And this snowballs into this, Sono Joi like movement. In 1866, there's a Satsuma Choshu alliance, between the 2 big domains that support this movement. And after that is, we could sum it up in a few sentences, but basically how do I say this? The Boshin War that happens later on, which was actually the formal war after trying to like overtake the Tokugawa shogunate, restore imperial rule. It was basically decided before that war even started. It was more like an after effect. You have the coincidental death, basically, of both the shogun and the emperor within a short time period. And so in 1866, the death of Tokugawa Iemochi, he's succeeded by Yoshinobu. And in 1867, Emperor Komei dies of smallpox, and he's succeeded by Prince Mutsuhito, but he's commonly referred to as Emperor Meiji. And so this coincidental change of power at the same time sort of led to this rethinking of things by their successors. And so this gets kind of complicated with the weird political relationships. But in 1867, basically, Tokugawa Yoshinobu just says he retires. He says, all right, I'll let the emperor do what he needs to do. I'm technically just cutting off the shogunate. And in 1868, the Emperor Meiji issues the formal edict saying, okay, in full restoration of imperial power, and he recognizes the resignation of Yoshinobu. And you think that'd be like, okay, everything's squared away. But a guy by the name of, he's going to become very important, Saigo Takamori.
Oh,
Like
Saigo.
in the imperial court was like, I'm not satisfied with just this. The imperial court was saying, okay, we can let the Tokugawa like just stick around and we can collaborate on the development of Japan from now on. It's like the imperial power is restored, but we don't have to like fully like get rid of the Tokugawa. No, Takamori says, no, we should abolish the shogun office, confiscate all of his lands, and then we'll like fully restore imperial power. Like, whoa. Yoshinobu, who's like just chilling, he's like, whoa, hang on, I didn't agree to this. I ain't giving up my land. So this confusion of a power struggle, basically, when they just agreed to like hand power over to the imperial office, led to the Boshin War. And so there's a lot of clashes and conflicts. There are periods where I think before this, there were like rumors that the imperial officers tried to burn down palaces at Edo, and there's like pushback. And eventually there's like shoguns, or not shoguns, the daimyo who defect from the shogunate to the imperial side. That was pretty important. But eventually, there was the admiral, I forgot to mention, Enomoto Takeaki, who was like an important admiral in the shogun army. He's the last holdout basically of this war. And this is hilarious. He goes up to Hokkaido and tries to establish his own government called the Republic of Ezo, where he's like the president. It's based on the Western framework. And he tries to get recognized by like the Americans and the British, but that doesn't hold out. And then the imperial forces are just like, no. So he eventually surrenders in 1869, and that marks the end, basically the sort of end of the Tokugawa shogunate as we know it. Any remnants are gone. And that's the beginning of the sort of Meiji period. This is known as the Meiji Restoration. And that's basically, yeah. I don't know if you guys have any other things to say, but
there is one important thing to mention with Saigo Takamori, because like right after the Boshin War, so the Boshin War essentially, as kind of Joy was saying, it was really more than it was kind of a foregone conclusion in some aspects, because the emperor was, he had so much support from a lot of individuals. But one of the things that was relevant was that, as Jerry said, Saigo Takamori wanted the shogunate abolished. And later on, he's kind of being famed as being the last true samurai, because one of the things that we sort of hinted at earlier was this idea of, samurai kind of were becoming less relevant in society. And there was this impending notion that samurai as a class were beginning to lose their influence and their status. And so Saigo Takamori actually was not really the one in charge of what was about to happen, but essentially there was this growing discontent amongst the Japanese population, among the samurai population, because all of a sudden their privileges are being cut off, like rice stipends and all that were being cut off from them as part of these changes. And the fellow samurai were like, dude, Saigo Takamori, like we gotta rebel. We can't let this go on. We gotta, like, we wanted to get rid of the shogun, but now the imperial house is gonna like end us. And so reluctantly he kind of agrees, and that's what leads to the Satsuma Rebellion, which is kind of the last major conflict before the true beginning of the Meiji era. It technically happens after the start of the Meiji era, but like it's kind of the last thing that really marks the end of the Edo period, you could say. Because what happened was that it's kind of seen in many ways as a kind of brave last stand of the samurai class to rebel against the imperial house. It culminated in the Battle of Shiroyama, which it led to Saigo Takamori's death, but it also led to the end of the rebellion. And so it's kind of seen almost like a noble thing in some parts of Japan, like Kagoshima in particular. We're kind of on Saigo Takamori's side in many ways. Whereas, like, he stood up for the Bushido spirits and fought to preserve the way of life of the samurai. But ultimately it got quashed because, I mean, a combination of the samurai just kind of as a class being weakened over these past 200 years, and just the imperial forces being so much more, there's a lot more of them. And so, yeah, that was really the thing that brought the Edo period to a close. And it really is kind of a huge watershed era shift from this point onwards, because the things that we associate with like cultural Japan, the things that we really associate with, the things that we talk about in our traditional episodes on our podcast. Basically, from this point onwards, anything that we talk about has already been established. And while it can evolve, and it has evolved from the future point, like new additions to the traditional aspects of Japanese culture aren't really seen from this point onwards, because the westernization that kind of occurs puts a stop to that. And all of a sudden, Japan is not really doing Japan things as much as they're doing Western things, but in a Japanese twist, right? Like
Yeah.
things that we would associate with Japan, sushi, ramen, hot springs, all that stuff, like that we associate with traditional Japan, that's already been established by this point. And it's I'm not gonna go as far as to say that there are no more additions to that after the Meiji begins, but I'm tempted to say that most of what Japan is about traditionally is kind of here already. So big era shifts from here on out.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, yeah, after the surrender of Edo during the Boshin War, it's renamed to Tokyo. So now we can start calling it what we recognize it as.
Eastern capital.
Yeah.
Woo!
That being said, I do believe it's still the capital, right? Like they just because the emperor lives in Kyoto doesn't mean that the capital changed back to Kyoto anymore.
Yeah, the emperor basically moves to like Edo and like establishes the palace there, I'm pretty sure. So
that's true, yeah, because right there's
something like that.
There's the imperial palace in Tokyo, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, in terms of like, there's a lot to really sort of discuss when it comes to the aspects of the Edo period that that are important for the rest of Japanese history moving forward. Because like with the Heian, it was a period of cultural development, but it was also a period of like kind of stagnation / decline of many of the aspects that the Sengoku era really sharpened, like the military influence, these like strong individual leaders and all that stuff. And it's kind of curious because just in terms of like how Japan was in relation to the rest of the world, which was undergoing its industrial revolution in the West and all that stuff. China was being demolished by the Western powers as well. So I'm not entirely sure, actually. This is a matter of debate. I'm not entirely sure whether or not the Sakoku actually helped Japan not meet the same fate as China in many ways,
Yeah,
To an extent, the only reason it did was because the Meiji Restoration was so successful. That's the only reason Japan didn't get completely screwed, because what ended up happening after the Tokugawa shogunate fell, Japan was like, wow, we're really far behind. And in the course of like 40 years, 30 to 40 years, they caught up to the rest of the world, which is easier because you're not inventing the technology, you're adopting it.
Yeah.
So it's not as hard, but it's still an incredibly impressive feat to have basically caught up, if not surpassed, some countries in select areas during the industrialization period. It was really impressive how quickly Japan modernized and optimized everything.
But we
that, which included military ranking, because military ranks completely changed. They had like a full.
Bryce, you're spoiling, bro.
I'm just saying, like they did some crazy stuff in that period of time, so they didn't get completely, thrown against the wall like China kind of did.
Yeah, like I guess more my question was more specifically like, because China also realized, oh crap, we're super far behind, but they never made any concerted effort to actually modernize themselves in the same way that Japan did. I was wondering like what led to the major restoration happening in Japan, but nothing similar happening in China. I guess that's a larger question.
The fear of death. What I'm thinking. I'd have to research this specifically, but one could reasonably deduce that China really didn't have any fear of the West as much as they had faith in their own ability to handle the West, which kind of just would lead to someone's downfall. Basically, hubris.
China did eventually split off into the what was I going to say here? Like there were massive attempts at reform in China. They just never really took off.
Ah, yes, reform.
Attempts at reform.
Yes, the shadow government.
All right. Anyway.
But yeah, like it's curious to know just how you can kind of dig into the psychology of the citizenry really with like things like the downfall of the Tokugawa, right? Because for instance, when your country is being attempting to be dominated by these superior military Western powers, right? Like
Yeah.
it's something. It says something about the way that the population kind of works, wherein you don't really look to the shogunate because the shogunate A has proven themselves ineffective, but also B they also conquered Japan through military might, right? Like it's not as though the gods meant for them to rule Japan, but
Yeah.
you can look towards the emperor because not only has he kind of been through this one line for all of Japan's written history, but also like if there's anything that makes Japan Japan and not Western in any similarity, it's the emperor. Because like you can draw
Yeah.
parallels that the shogunate kind of only took power because of like Western trade with guns and of course tactics and having a big military. When in a time of crisis, the population might want to fall back on something that makes them simple, more simply Japanese, and that would be quintessentially the emperor.
Yeah.
I can agree with that.
And it's something that I think can it really has kind of ripple effects throughout the rest of history because the only condition that Japan had, and this is I guess a spoiler, but everyone knows where World War II ended. The only thing that Japan would not budge on no matter what, even upon the threat of getting nuked into oblivion, was that the emperor was not to be deposed under any circumstances. And like it's kind of one of those things where it truly is kind of a cultural difference in a way because to the US, right, like having a king is something that you wouldn't, it's not very desirable. Like if you walk to any guy from the US, like, hey, would you like to be a king of the US? They'd be like, heck no, why would I want that? Who are you? Get out of my house. And so,
Get out of my house.
like, it's kind of a thing where it can be difficult for many Americans to kind of conceptualize just how much it's kind of the same with Britain as well to an extent, but like it's kind of weird to think about how much the emperor really means to the Japanese population, right?
Mm.
As kind of a figurehead, and I think that that's something that really the Meiji era will demonstrate how important that is. Like I don't know anything about the current emperor of Japan, like as a Japanese citizen, but I would still fight on his behalf because that's what it means. That's what that culture is there for.
So you're saying he's a waifu?
Actually, that's all I'm hearing. The emperor
Waifu to
has
die
always.
for.
Yes, sir. Run that. Run that.
Yeah,
Run that.
real best waifu. Anyway, and so the like it's huge how much that cultural phenomenon of the emperor and kind of being the representation of Japanese culture in a way, the linchpin of it all. That's maybe the one thing that definitely does become a huge thing of growth during the Meiji Restoration, instead of other aspects of Japanese culture, which have already been established and will only just evolve, not create new ones.
Yeah.
So yeah, any final thoughts about the Edo period, just in terms of like what we can say to wrap things up? I think this is a good place.
Not much. I mean, I think we went over everything.
We covered everything that's most important for it.
Yeah, it's funny because like there's just entire decades long periods of time where nothing happens that's worthy of being historically recorded.
Yeah.
Like sure, there's like local stuff, but if we got into that, we'd be here for hours and hours and hours. So we don't do that. If you want that, read a book, I'd say. Because trust me when I say if you're the kind of person that will dig deep into the specific effects of what occurred in like 1738 in Edo, Japan, you don't need us to tell you about the Edo period. You probably know more than we do. So we hope that you got a lot of information on this. And the Edo period as a whole is kind of less talked about than other parts of Japanese history, just by virtue of, how most of the achievements that were done through it weren't like military or international in many ways. Like the big things about the Edo period are how it began and how it ended. But it's important to recognize that a lot of cultural development and a lot of changes in lifestyle really did happen during the Edo period. So we hope that you learned something new about that period while you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's that's going to wrap things up for this particular episode of the Japan Club Weekly Podcast. We hope that you learned something. And if you're still around to listen to this end note, then thank you so much for giving us your attention. However, we will point out to our loyal viewers that next week we'll be taking a break, so there won't be an episode of the podcast next week. We have some events locally that will take up a lot of our time. So unfortunately, we will see you guys 2 weeks from now instead of 1 week from now. But we hope that this injection of Japanese history has given you something to think about for at least the next couple of weeks. And with that, we can bid you guys farewell. So, peace out.
Yeah.
Later.